The boardroom felt like a courtroom. Mason Trent slammed my report onto the polished oak table, with a sound that made everyone flinch. 23 executives watched as our CEO held up my 8 months of work like it was garbage. This, he sneered, pointing at my proposal, is what happens when outdated employees try to predict the future. Laughter rippled across the room. Not polite chuckles, but actual laughter. My predictive analytics model, the one I'd worked nights and weekends to perfect, became their entertainment. The projector showed my name in bold letters while Mason called me dead weight, in front of the cameras they'd brought for their quarterly PR feature. I forced a polite nod while humiliation burned through my chest. Every smirk, every whispered comment, every head shake was recorded in my memory. The same executives I'd trained were now watching my professional execution. Some people, Mason continued, simply can't keep up with innovation. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap. I didn't defend myself. I didn't argue. I just memorized every single word he said. The fluorescent lights above seemed to buzz louder with each passing second. My throat felt dry as dust, but I refused to reach for the water glass sitting mockingly in front of me. These people would not see me break. HR escorted me out for my well-being, before I could even return to my desk. My badge was deactivated while I walked down the hallway. 29 years at Alturian Systems, and my access was cut in 15 minutes. I sat in my car in the parking lot, hands gripping the steering wheel. Through the glass windows, I could see my former colleagues returning to their desks, probably already gossiping about what they'd witnessed. You just watched a career execution. I'd heard someone whisper as I left the room. The official email arrived on my phone before I'd even driven home. Departmental restructuring, it said. Effective immediately. My laptop would be wiped. My parking spot reassigned. My projects transferred to younger team members. I stared at the corporate building where I'd spent most of my adult life. The place where I'd helped design the algorithms that made Alturian billions. Where I'd mentored half the people who just laughed at my humiliation. I didn't cry. Instead, I started my car and drove home, already planning my next move. The security guard who'd known me for 15 years avoided eye contact as I passed his station. Even the receptionist who always complimented my presentations pretended to be absorbed in her computer screen. Cowardice spreads faster than courage in corporate environments. My name is Evelyn Brooks. I'm 52 years old, and until 2 hours ago, I was senior project strategist at Alturian Systems. I helped build this tech company from a startup to a Fortune 500 giant. I've spent nearly 3 decades designing models that predict human behavior through machine learning. I trained most of the executives who just watched my public humiliation. I wrote the original code for half their current products. My algorithms process millions of data points every day, making Alturian over $200 million annually. And yet, I was erased in 15 minutes. My daughter called that evening. "Mom, you should sue them," she said after I told her what happened. I smiled, stirring my tea calmly. "Not yet, honey. Not yet." "What do you mean?" "I mean timing is everything in business. And right now they think they've won." She didn't understand, but she would. Everyone would, eventually. Mason Trent had just made the biggest mistake of his career, but he didn't know it yet. My kitchen felt strangely peaceful after the chaos of the boardroom. The familiar ritual of brewing chamomile tea helped steady my racing thoughts. Outside my window, suburban life continued normally while my professional world had just exploded into fragments. The next week brought awkward condolences from former colleagues. Text messages saying things like, "I can't believe what happened," and "Mason was completely out of line." LinkedIn connections expressing shock at my sudden departure. But nobody spoke up during the meeting. Nobody defended me. They all just watched. Mason never contacted me directly. Why would he? In his mind, I was finished. Yesterday's news. An obstacle he'd successfully removed from his path to glory. My official company laptop arrived by courier, wiped clean. My personal items from my office came in a cardboard box. 29 years reduced to a few coffee mugs and family photos. The local business journal ran a small piece about restructuring at Alturian. My name wasn't mentioned. I was just an unnamed casualty of corporate efficiency. I kept watering my plants, cooking dinner, and reading. To anyone watching, I looked like a woman quietly accepting her fate. A 52-year-old professional forced into early retirement. But appearances can be deceiving. My neighbor Mrs. Chun brought homemade cookies and gentle sympathy, assuming I was devastated by unemployment. Her kindness touched me deeply, though she couldn't know I was actually plotting the most methodical professional comeback in Silicon Valley history. Sometimes grief and strategy look identical from the outside. A week later, an automated email hit my personal inbox. It was an old notification from Alturian's internal research repository, a system I'd helped design years ago. The alert was simple. New upload, Project Nexus, lead author, Mason Trent. I opened the attachment and felt my blood pressure spike. It was my code, my architecture, my predictive model that I'd presented in that boardroom. Every algorithm, every data structure, every innovative solution I'd spent 8 months creating. But now it had Mason's name on it. I scrolled through the documentation, recognizing my own work, the variable names I'd chosen, the comments I'd written. Even my signature coding style was embedded throughout the entire project. Mason had simply stolen my work and put his name on it. I saved everything to my personal drive and closed my laptop. Then I sat in my kitchen, drinking tea and thinking. This wasn't just professional backstabbing. This was theft. And theft, unlike humiliation, has legal consequences. My hands trembled slightly as I copied the files, not from fear but from a cold, calculating rage I hadn't felt in decades. This single moment transformed my dismissal from embarrassing setback to criminal conspiracy. Mason had just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy him completely. 2 days later, a friendly analyst from Alturian's research division forwarded me an internal memo. She'd always appreciated my mentorship and was horrified by how I'd been treated. The memo was from Mason to the executive team. Subject line: Trent AI Initiative Phase 1 complete. With Evelyn's exit, it read, "We now have clean intellectual property rights to rebrand the predictive model as Trent AI. Legal confirms no ownership conflicts." Attached was a voice recording of Mason laughing about the situation. "She'll never know the difference," his voice said clearly. "By the time this launches, she'll be forgotten." I listened to that recording 3 times, taking notes. Mason wasn't just taking credit for my work. He was actively planning to build his reputation on algorithms I'd created. Trent AI was going to be his ticket to industry fame. I forwarded everything to my personal email and deleted the original. Then I called my lawyer. Harold Quinn had handled my patents for 15 years. He knew my work better than anyone. "They can't do this," he said after reviewing the files. The analyst who'd forwarded the memo was Sarah Martinez, a brilliant young woman I'd mentored through her first 3 years at Alturian. Her loyalty in this moment proved that genuine leadership creates bonds stronger than corporate politics. Good people remember who believed in them when it mattered most. Harold and I met the next morning at his downtown office. He'd spent the night reviewing my documentation, and his expression was grim. "This is clear intellectual property theft," he said, spreading papers across his conference table. "Your original code signatures are embedded throughout their Project Nexus. The timestamps prove you created this months before your termination." I nodded calmly. "So what can we do?" "We can file an injunction immediately. Stop their launch, demand acknowledgement of authorship, seek damages." "No," I said. "Not yet." Harold looked surprised. "Evelyn, they're about to launch your work under Mason's name. Every day we wait makes this harder to prove." I smiled. "Harold, I've been predicting human behavior for 3 decades. Trust me on this one. We wait." "For what?" "For Mason to get comfortable. For him to stake his entire reputation on my work. For Alturian to invest millions in marketing Trent AI." Harold stared at me. "You want them to succeed first?" "I want them to have everything to lose." Harold's conference room overlooked the financial district, where deals worth billions were negotiated daily. But our quiet strategy session felt more significant than any corporate merger. We weren't just planning a lawsuit. We were architecting the complete destruction of a powerful man's career through his own arrogance. I spent the next month quietly building my case. Every email, every code commit, every version history from my years at Alturian. I had documentation going back to the project's inception, time-stamped proof of my authorship. More importantly, I had something Mason didn't know about. Years ago, when I'd negotiated my employment contract, I'd insisted on a specific clause. Any intellectual property I developed remained mine unless explicitly transferred in writing through a formal assignment process. I'd written that clause myself, buried in the technical language of page 47. Alturian's lawyers had approved it without really reading it, assuming it was standard boilerplate. It wasn't standard at all. Harold confirmed what I already knew. Mason's theft was legally indefensible. But more than that, Alturian's entire claim to my algorithms was void. They'd never formally assigned my intellectual property to the company. This clause is brilliant, Harold said. You basically retained ownership of everything you created. I smiled. I learned early to protect myself. The contract negotiation had happened during Alturian's rapid growth phase, when they were desperate to retain talent and willing to accept unusual terms. My younger self had been wiser than I'd realized, planting seeds of protection that would bloom into full legal warfare decades later. Patience and paranoia make powerful allies. 2 months passed. Mason's project gained serious traction. Tech blogs called Trent AI revolutionary. Investors praised Mason's vision. The company's stock price climbed 15% on the strength of his supposed innovation. Mason was invited to keynote the National Technology Innovation Conference. The same conference where I'd presented my early research 3 years ago, back when Mason was just another middle manager. Industry magazines published profiles calling him a visionary leader. Forbes mentioned him as a candidate for their 40 under 40 list, even though he was 42. Meanwhile, I maintained my quiet routine. Morning walks, afternoon reading, evening cooking. To my neighbors, I looked like any other retiree adjusting to life after corporate stress. But I was actually preparing for war. Harold filed the preliminary paperwork quietly, ensuring everything was ready. We had injunctions prepared, ownership claims documented, and a comprehensive legal strategy mapped out. All we needed was the right moment. Every morning I jogged past Alturian's headquarters, watching the confident executives arrive in their luxury cars. They had no idea that the woman they'd dismissed as irrelevant was methodically documenting every public statement Mason made about his innovation. Each interview became evidence of his fraud. Success would be his downfall. Launch week arrived with tremendous fanfare. Alturian's marketing department spent $2 million promoting Trent AI. Mason gave interviews to every major tech publication. The company scheduled a live demonstration for investors and press. That's when I fired the first shot. On Tuesday morning, exactly 48 hours before the public launch, Harold filed a temporary restraining order claiming ownership of the Nexus algorithm. We simultaneously submitted a formal intellectual property complaint with detailed evidence of my authorship. The legal documents hit Alturian's headquarters like a bomb. Within an hour, their phones were ringing off the hook. Investors demanding explanations. Lawyers scrambling to understand the claim. Marketing teams frantically calling Harold's office. Funding for Trent AI froze instantly. The press demonstration was quietly canceled. Mason's keynote invitation was postponed pending legal review. I watched the chaos unfold from my living room, sipping coffee and reading the frantic news updates. After 2 months of silence, I'd finally spoken. And my voice carried more weight than Mason ever imagined. The timing was surgical precision. Tuesday morning meant maximum disruption before their Wednesday launch, giving them just enough time to panic, but not enough to mount an effective response. I'd spent decades studying optimal timing in predictive models. Human destruction followed the same mathematical principles as market analysis. The internal panic at Alturian was immediate and spectacular. Screenshots of their Slack messages started circulating online within hours, leaked by employees who were tired of Mason's arrogance. Legal says the patent's contested by some former employee? Who the hell is Evelyn Brooks? The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Mason tried claiming that my work was derivative of existing company research. Harold responded by showing that I'd created the foundational algorithms 3 years before joining the specific project team. When Mason suggested the work was collaborative, Harold produced meeting notes showing I'd explicitly presented these concepts as my individual contribution. By Thursday, Alturian's legal department was advising immediate settlement discussions. The company couldn't afford a prolonged intellectual property battle, with the press watching every move. Mason's lawyer quietly reached out to Harold. What would it take to make this go away? I smiled when Harold told me about the call. They were starting to understand the scope of their problem. Mason's desperate attempts at deflection only highlighted the weakness of his position. Each lie required 3 more lies to support it, creating an unstable foundation that crumbled under scrutiny. His legal team was clearly advising him to surrender, but his ego wouldn't allow acknowledgement of defeat. Pride would be his final mistake. That's when things got interesting. Someone anonymously leaked a comprehensive file to TechCrunch titled, "The True Creator of Trent AI." The package contained meeting transcripts, email chains, and my signature code patterns embedded throughout Mason's supposed innovation. The journalist who received the leak was thorough. She contacted former Alturian employees, reviewed public patent filings, and traced the algorithm's development timeline. Her investigation painted a clear picture. Mason had stolen my work and tried to erase my contribution. The story went viral on LinkedIn within 6 hours. Tech industry leaders shared it with comments like, "This is why we need better IP protection," and "Women in tech face this constantly." Suddenly, my quiet legal battle became a very public conversation about corporate ethics and intellectual property theft. Mason's representatives tried damage control, releasing a statement about ongoing legal discussions and mutual respect for intellectual contributions. But the narrative had already shifted. Everyone was asking the same question. If Mason was really the genius behind Trent AI, why couldn't he explain how the algorithms actually worked? The anonymous leak came from multiple sources within Alturian, coordinated by employees who'd grown disgusted with Mason's behavior. Sarah Martinez had quietly organized a network of witnesses willing to testify about his pattern of theft and intimidation. Sometimes justice requires a conspiracy of conscience among the powerless to defeat the corrupt powerful. Alturian's stock price plummeted. By Friday morning, they'd lost over 30% of their market value. Major clients were calling to discuss contingency plans in case the Trent AI launch was permanently canceled. Mason canceled his keynote appearance, citing unforeseen circumstances. The conference organizers, reading the news coverage, quietly offered me his speaking slot instead. I politely declined. I wasn't ready to be public yet. That afternoon, I received a call from Alturian's board secretary. Her voice was carefully professional but clearly strained. "Ms. Brooks, the board would very much like to discuss a resolution to this situation. Would you be available to meet next week?" I paused thoughtfully. "I'm listening. We believe there may have been some misunderstandings about the intellectual property involved in Project Nexus. The board is prepared to discuss appropriate recognition of your contributions." Translation. They were panicking and needed my cooperation to save the company. "I'll have my lawyer contact you to schedule something appropriate," I said calmly. When I hung up, I couldn't help but smile. The same board that had watched my humiliation 2 months ago was now begging for a meeting. The chairman looked directly at Mason. "Is there any documentation showing collaborative development of these algorithms?" Mason's lawyer whispered something in his ear. Mason's face darkened, but he shook his head. "The intellectual property analysis is clear," the legal counsel continued. "Ms. Brooks retained ownership under her employment contract. The company never formally acquired these specific algorithms." I watched Mason's expression change as the reality sank in. Not only had he stolen my work, but he'd built Alturian's entire AI strategy on technology the company didn't actually own. "We're prepared to meet your terms," the chairman said finally. "Official recognition, consulting royalties, and public acknowledgement." Mason looked like he'd been punched. "This will destroy the Trent AI brand." "The Trent AI brand is built on stolen technology," I replied calmly. Perhaps you should have considered that before putting your name on my work. The room fell silent. After all his arrogance, all his public humiliation of me, Mason was finally facing consequences. We'll need this resolved quickly, the chairman added. The longer this drags out, the worse it gets for everyone. Especially for Mason, I thought but didn't say. Mason's lawyer was frantically scribbling notes, probably calculating the massive financial exposure his client faced. The legal implications went beyond intellectual property theft into potential securities fraud for misleading investors. Mason hadn't just stolen my work. He'd built a house of cards that was about to collapse and bury his career beneath the rubble. That evening, news broke that sent shockwaves through the tech industry. Alturian CEO under federal investigation for intellectual property fraud. The Department of Justice had apparently taken interest in the case, particularly the criminal aspects of knowingly filing false patent claims. How far did you think it would go? The company's dying, Evelyn. The federal investigation, the stock collapse, the client defections. If you don't sign a settlement release, Alturian won't survive the quarter. I poured myself tea, not offering him any. Now you understand pressure. He leaned forward desperately. What do you want? Money? A position? Full recognition? Just name your price. I sipped my tea thoughtfully. I want a public apology. Seeing Mason on my doorstep felt surreal, like watching a movie villain suddenly appear in real life pleading for mercy. His expensive suit was rumpled and stained, his usually perfect hair disheveled. The powerful executive who'd terrorized employees for years now sat broken in my living room, reduced to begging the woman he'd tried to destroy. A public apology? Mason looked confused. That's it. At the next shareholders' meeting, in front of the board, the investors, and the press, you will acknowledge that Alturian's AI success is built on my work, not yours. Mason's face went pale. Evelyn, that would be professional suicide. Your professional suicide began when you decided to humiliate me in that boardroom. I'm just helping you finish what you started. But if I do that publicly, my career in tech is over. No one will ever hire me again. I met his eyes directly. You should have thought about that before you called me dead weight on camera. Harold arrived an hour later with a settlement agreement. Mason would make a full public confession at the shareholders' meeting, acknowledging my authorship of the AI technology and formally apologizing for his attempted theft. Mason read through the terms twice, his hands shaking slightly. He looked up at me with something approaching respect. You really planned all of this, didn't you? I spent 29 years learning how to predict human behavior, I replied. You were surprisingly predictable. He signed the agreement with a trembling hand. The settlement terms were elegantly simple, but devastatingly comprehensive. Mason would admit his theft publicly, acknowledge my authorship completely, and surrender all claims to the technology. His signature on that document was more than legal consent. It was his acceptance of professional execution. Justice sometimes requires perpetrators to pull their own trigger. The shareholders' meeting. Corporate executions rarely happen so publicly, but Mason's arrogance had demanded an equally public reckoning for his crimes. The applause spread through the auditorium, until the entire room was giving me a standing ovation. I stood gracefully, nodding acknowledgement to the crowd, feeling vindicated for the first time in months. After the meeting, Alturian's board offered me Mason's position as CEO. The salary was substantial, the equity package generous, and the opportunity for vindication complete. I declined politely. Thank you, but I'm not interested in titles anymore, I told the chairman. Freedom is worth more than corporate power. What will you do? Consult independently. License my technology fairly. Maybe teach some courses about intellectual property protection. The board looked disappointed but unsurprised. They'd lost both their CEO and their most innovative technologist in the same day. Within hours, my consulting phone was ringing. Universities wanted to license my algorithms. Startups offered partnership deals. Venture capital firms requested meetings. After 29 years of building someone else's empire, I was finally building my own. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with several Alturian employees openly weeping as they applauded. These were people who'd witnessed my contributions for years, but had been too afraid to speak up during Mason's reign of terror. My vindication became their liberation from a toxic corporate culture that punished integrity and rewarded theft. My patent was officially reinstated with full recognition of my authorship. MIT invited me to present a guest lecture series. Harvard Business School wanted to write a case study about intellectual property protection. Young women in tech began reaching out, thanking me for proving that brilliance doesn't expire with age. They shared stories of their own battles against age discrimination and credit theft. I started a consulting practice focused on helping innovators protect their intellectual property. My first clients were 3 women engineers who'd learned from my experience to document everything and negotiate better employment contracts. The irony was perfect. Mason's attempt to erase me had actually amplified my voice throughout the entire industry. Tech journals published features about my career and innovations. Conference organizers competed to book me as a keynote speaker. Investment firms sought my advice on evaluating AI technologies. I was busier at 52 than I'd ever been at 32, but this time I controlled my own destiny. The lecture series at MIT drew standing room-only crowds, with students camping out overnight for tickets. My story resonated beyond tech circles, inspiring women in every industry to document their work and protect their innovations. Academic institutions worldwide began revising their intellectual property policies based on lessons from my case. One woman's fight became a movement. Mason's public confession made international news. His resignation became a cautionary tale taught in business schools. His attempt to steal credit became a case study in corporate ethics courses. He never worked in tech again. His LinkedIn profile listed him as an independent consultant, but industry insiders knew he was unemployable. Word spread quickly in Silicon Valley. Mason Trent was the CEO who got caught stealing from his own employee. The press called his downfall a spectacular self-destruction. But I knew better. Mason hadn't destroyed himself accidentally. He'd destroyed himself systematically through arrogance, theft, and cruelty. 3 months later, the National Technology Innovation Conference invited me to deliver the keynote address Mason had lost. The same stage where he would have presented my stolen work became my platform for discussing innovation integrity. When they try to erase your name, I told the audience, don't fight for visibility, fight for truth. Truth lasts longer than titles. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. Business schools worldwide now teach the Mason Trent case as required curriculum in ethics courses. His downfall became a template for understanding how intellectual property theft destroys careers and companies. Students learn about the legal, financial, and reputational consequences of claiming credit for others' innovations. His name became synonymous with corporate fraud and arrogance. I visited Alturian's headquarters one final time, 6 months after my humiliation. The building looked smaller somehow, diminished by the ongoing federal investigation and leadership chaos. My reflection glowed on the glass wall where they'd installed a new patent plaque, Project Nexus, invented by Dr. Evelyn Brooks. The same lobby where I'd been escorted out in shame now displayed my achievement prominently. New employees learned my story during orientation. My algorithms powered their most successful products. A young engineer approached me nervously. Dr. Brooks? I just wanted to say thank you. Your case convinced me to keep detailed documentation of my own work. Smart, I replied. Always protect your innovations. Will you be coming back to work here? I smiled, looking around the lobby one last time. No. Some chapters end so better ones can begin. As I walked toward the exit, I passed the boardroom where my nightmare had started. The same room where Mason had called me dead weight now hosted meetings where executives discussed licensing my technology. The patent plaque was engraved in elegant gold lettering, impossible to miss by anyone entering the building. Alturian had installed it prominently as both recognition and reminder of what happens when companies mistreat their innovators. The lobby display became a pilgrimage site for young engineers who came to see where one woman's courage changed corporate culture forever. Today I run my own technology consulting firm from a corner office overlooking the city. My algorithms power systems across multiple companies, all properly licensed and attributed. Young innovators seek my mentorship. Universities compete for my research collaboration. The woman who was publicly humiliated for being outdated is now considered one of the industry's most forward-thinking voices. My phone buzzed with a text from my daughter. Saw your Forbes interview, Mom. So proud of you. I smiled, looking out at the skyline. Mason had thought erasing me would clear his path to glory. Instead, his cruelty had forced me to claim the recognition I'd always deserved. Sometimes the biggest betrayals become the greatest gifts. They teach us who we really are when everything else is stripped away. I opened my laptop and began reviewing a proposal from a promising young engineer. Her cover letter mentioned my story as inspiration for pursuing her own patent applications. The next generation was learning from my experience. They were documenting their work, protecting their innovations, and refusing to let anyone steal their genius. Some signatures don't need ink. Just patience, preparation, and the courage to stand up when it matters most. Mason taught me that lesson, though he never intended to. In trying to destroy me, he'd simply revealed my true strength. My consulting firm's waiting room displays framed copies of supportive letters from clients, patent certificates, and photos from speaking engagements. But the centerpiece is a simple handwritten note from Sarah Martinez. Thank you for showing us that integrity wins in the end. The young mentor had become the elder guardian, ensuring future generations would never suffer the theft I'd endured.